since we agreed at the Paris Accord in December last year, which has received support from India, from China, of the United States and the Europeans, and of course Australia, we now share common responsibilities for acting on bringing down global carbon emissions because of the agreed impact which that has on climate change, and dangerous climate change, and some would argue irreversible climate change unless we act early enough. So we've all got responsibilities. The best discipline that can be applied, I think, in dealing with these challenges is, number one, to give renewable industries and energy sectors a strong start. And often that's achieved by what we've done in Australia and other countries have done, which is establish a mandatory, legally enforceable renewable energy target. We've done that, and we set 20% by 2020 from a renewable sector which was barely 4% of electricity supply when we passed the Act of Parliament when I was Prime Minister. Now we're at about 15, moving towards 20. And I would strongly recommend, in whichever country we're talking about, that that's necessary to establish a critical mass within the renewable energy sector, whether we're talking about solar or wind or other such generation. On the carbon side of the equation, we can't simply wish it away. We cannot wave a magic wand. It's real, it's a challenge, and will be with us for a long time yet, particularly in terms of the industrializing economies that we have in China and India. So the key question is what then to do? We can't simply say to China and India, sorry, stop developing, too difficult for us, too difficult for you, so let's keep all your people in poverty. That's just wrong. So the critical challenge is therefore to introduce the disciplines of a carbon price by either carbon taxes or potentially an emissions trading scheme or some other such arrangement, which causes firms and governments to understand what the real price of carbon is. And secondly, within carbon itself, to look at the least damaging carbon impacts, which in this order are gas, oil and coal being the most injurious, and within coal, cleaner coal as opposed to dirtier coal. And I think the final part of the equation is to work collaboratively on carbon capture and storage technologies as well. It's that set of responses which is necessary, and that applies also to the coal import requirements of India in the future as well.
Right, so India obviously has challenges about managing its fossil fuel consumption. From an Australian side, what's the thinking in terms of how much coal should Australia really export, given that this is the coal that finally goes and feeds the power plants in India or China or elsewhere, which causes the problems that we are all aware of?
I think the key question here is always going to be on the purchaser's part. And if you have an effective coal price within your economies, that will direct decisions, or carbon price within your economies, that will direct decisions to cleaner energy technologies, but also, on the other side of the equation, also to higher levels of energy efficiency. For example, in India, you have had historically a large problem in terms of line wastage, and sometimes line theft as well. Not unique to India, my friend. It happens all around the world, but you've got a bad dose of it here. And so dealing with electricity wastage, dealing with energy efficiency with homes and within offices, within plants, as well as an effective carbon price, which will cause electricity generators to think once, twice and thrice about what their source will be. I think that's the discipline which everyone will need to apply. What I notice, for example, in terms of Chinese imports of Australian coal, is that they have come down, partly in response to China's own emerging clean energy regime.
Right. A sense on how you see Australia playing a role in this part of the world, particularly given the current economic situation where obviously many emerging markets are not doing well, with some exception obviously from India. But do you see things changing? Do you see the composition of the economy changing in response to that?
Composition of the Indian economy or the Australian?
Economy.
I think it's important to understand where our economies fit globally. The Asia-Pacific region, of which we're both members, represents about 55% of global GDP, if you include within that the United States, China and India. Secondly, we represent just under 50% of global trade. It's a pretty dynamic part of the world. But of course it's got its own problems. We have slowing growth in China, we have recovering growth in the United States, and we have quite strong growth here in India, despite the technical debate about your economic growth series in statistics. But mind you, those debates aren't unique to India either, in fairness to my friends in Delhi. And so the Indian economy, therefore, is the fastest growing large economy in the world, 7.5, 7.85, depending on what the real number is. Australia, we're now entering our 24th year of consecutive positive growth. I'm pleased to say in our entire period in office that was continued despite the global financial crisis. And Australia is not a small economy, it's a middle-sized economy. It's 1.5, 1.8 trillion. India, I think, is a $2.2 trillion economy. So my view about the two is that, frankly, we should be doing a lot more together and beyond traditional sectors of engagement, which is, on the one hand, energy resources into India, and on the other hand, Indian information technology sales into Australia. I think geography speaks to our advantage, quite close. Huge Indian population of Australia. They've also helped liberate us from the terrors of English cuisine. We've now got decent food in the country for the first time. But frankly, if you look at the structural complementarities of the two economies, I think they're great. Australians are first class in medical research, in the life sciences, in the biosciences, and in the delivery of health services. It's a world-class system. And frankly, I think there is a great opportunity for business here in that domain. Similarly, given your own strengths in the information technology sector, there's no reason why you should not become the principal suppliers of software and hardware into the Australian economy. And then, of course, we have already a continuing education market.
Last question. If you were to be at the United Nations, what would be your 3 priorities?
Well, my strong belief is that the next Secretary General of the United Nations is likely to be from Eastern Europe, as I've always said. But if you look more broadly at the UN structure, one of the things that I've been doing the last 18 months, apart from being president of the Asia Society Policy Institute in New York, I've also been chair of the Independent Commission on Multilateralism. We spent 1.5 years looking at one question: is the UN system fit for purpose for the demands of global governance in the 21st century? Hard question. In peace and security, in development and sustainable development, in humanitarian affairs and human rights, as well as how do you fund the whole operation? I think there are a couple of core challenges. One, how do we make sure that the UN's diplomacy and security policy is as preventative as possible rather than reactive? The UN historically reacts to global crises when they occur, and 20 or 30 years later we're often still in the field. How can you act more preventatively through preemptive, what I describe as political diplomacy among the parties? That's key issue number one. Key issue number two, in sustainable development, we've all just agreed on the Sustainable Development Goals. I think they're a great framework. Of course, being a pragmatic Australian, I ask myself the question, hey guys, where's the cash? What's going to make this happen? And so we need, I think, a revolution in the way in which we approach the deployment of private capital with public capital in building the infrastructure necessary to realise the Sustainable Development Goals, including in critical...
You see the UN playing a more facilitative role there rather than actually doing the funding itself? Or
well, I think the UN funding, to be blunt, if you look at global ODA, at present stands at about 140 billion a year and falling. If you look at the demands on the humanitarian budget alone, it's massive. And so therefore, when you look at the development task, including the sustainable development task, climate change agenda, we're going to increasingly have to deploy the limited public capital available through the UN and the multilateral development banks with private capital. And if there's a third area I think we need to look at very carefully for the future, it's what we do in terms of the future management of global people movements. Our friends in Europe are throwing their hands up in the air about the arrival of 1 or 2 million Syrian refugees. The problem is it's been rapid and uncontrolled and with political consequences and reinforcing isolationist and protectionist sentiments in Europe. So our system of managing refugees through the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the Refugees Conventions of the 1950s, I think we need to look carefully at how that is better done in the future, with a new global approach which looks at source countries, wherever they happen to be, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Syria, or in the future it might be somewhere else. Neighbouring countries where the burden basically spills to immediately next door. How do we support them properly when they're taking in large numbers of refugees or asylum seekers? Transit countries, when they become the vehicles through which people move to the fourth part of the equation, which is destination countries, and a better system of global burden sharing between them, rather than a few countries taking the most. So I think these are critical areas of potential reform for the system for the future.
Siddharth, thank you very much and all the best if you were to be there.
Oh, I don't think I'm Eastern European. So
Thank you so much.
all the best.